If you have the hubcap on the wheel, go ahead and remove the little caps that hold it on with a 19mm socket. Set this aside, then take off all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts, and then we'll take the wheel off. Start by removing this nut here that holds the brake hose onto the strut. 10mm socket, and then with a little hammer you'll have to push the stud in a little bit. That should unlodge it. Pretty stuck in here. There we go. Now with a 15mm socket, I'm going to take these 2 bolts out and take the caliper with the bracket directly off of the knuckle. Leave this in a couple threads, that way it holds the caliper as you take off this top one. Take the bolts out. Watch out, the caliper is going to want to fall. Bring it up, and I like to just set it right here on top of the strut. That way it's being held on and it's not putting any pressure on this brake hose. Take your new caliper apart so we can prepare for installation. Set the main part of the caliper aside, and on this piece right here we'll need to add some grease to these 2 ears here. That way no rust can form here underneath the anti-rattle clips. Very thin layer will go a long way. You don't need a lot. And then get one of these, press it on, make sure it slides on all the way. You don't want it falling off or anything. We'll do the same to the other side. Press it on. All right, now let's take these sliders out and we'll add grease to them. I like to add some grease. I like to add grease inside of the boot here. This is going to act as a reserve of grease because you can't put a whole lot on the pin itself. So once you put it in there, work it in, and you can coat the pin in a light layer of grease. Slide it in, press it all the way in, and to remove the excess air, you can see how it's bouncing back because there's extra pressure in there. Squeeze the boot as you press on the pin. That'll push out any extra air. Let's do the same thing to this side. And make sure that you put the pins back into their corresponding side because the one that we just did has a rubber boot on it. This one does not. So that's important. Add some grease in there, then add grease to the pin. Slide it in. And when you put those in, just give them a couple twists. That way the grease works its way in there. Wipe off any excess grease, and let's mount this onto the vehicle. Let's coat this hub in anti-seize. That way rust doesn't build up in the future and the rotor doesn't stick onto the hub in the future. A thin layer all around will do the trick. You don't need a ton. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs if possible. If you get a lot on there, just wipe it off. Take your rotor, slide it on. Now grab your caliper, your old one, take the pads out. There we go. Take the new bracket, slide it over, line up the bolt holes, start in the bolts, snug these up, and then torque them to 96 foot-pounds. Take your pads, put them on. The inner pad has this wear indicator that's supposed to go on the bottom. And then the outer pad does not have a wear indicator. Before you put on the main part of the caliper, let's add a little bit of grease to the outer ring of this piston here. Not a lot, just a thin layer. This is going to help the brakes operate quietly and smoothly, as well as on these 2 ears. Slide the caliper over the pads, make sure it lines up with the slider pins. Get your bolts, start them on, snug them up, and then we'll torque them to 26 foot-pounds. There it is. Now take this banjo bolt out to prepare the caliper for the hose. You want to make sure that these washers come off with it. With a collection bucket underneath, remove the banjo bolt off of your old caliper. It's an 11mm. Okay, fluid's going to come out. Make sure both of the old crush washers are off. This one isn't, so let's remove it. I'm just going to grab it with some pliers and take it off of here. Before reinstalling the hose, wipe off the surface with a rag to make sure that it is nice and clean. Then take your new banjo bolt with a crush washer, slide it on, and then another crush washer, so you want to sandwich the hose in between the crush washers, and slide it onto the new caliper, line it up, start the bolt in, and then we'll snug it up. When I tighten these, once it bottoms out, which is right about here, I like to go about half a turn. That way these crush washers can crush, and that's what makes a good seal. All right, well, that wasn't quite half, but it's pretty tight, so maybe a third. Between a third and a half should be good. No leaks. Let's clean this up to actually ensure that there are no leaks. Otherwise, if you have fluid here, you won't know if it's a leak or if it's remaining fluid. Now, right up here with a 10 millimeter, let's undo the bleeder screw. Take this cover off first. There we go. We'll start with a gravity bleed. What that consists of is it's going to let gravity pull fluid down the hose into the caliper and push the air out the bleeder screw. Once there are no more air bubbles with the gravity bleed, we'll turn to a manual brake bleed, and that consists of having someone in the car pumping the brake pedal. Of course, you want to check your master cylinder, make sure that's full. With pressure being held on the brake pedal after a few pumps, open the bleeder screw. Watch out because fluid's going to come shooting out with potentially air bubbles. And once the pedal reaches the floor, close this, pump it up again, repeat the process until you have no more air bubbles. Then top off your master cylinder, and then you can put the wheel on. But for now, let's finish for the gravity bleed to be done. There's fluid coming out with no air bubbles, so I'm going to close this up, snug it. Now you can perform your manual brake bleed. After that's done, clean things up here. That way you don't think that there's a leak. And put on this little cap for the bleeder screw. It's important. That prevents debris from getting in there. Don't forget to put this retainer back for the brake hose. Slide it onto the strut. Start on the nut and snug it up. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, snug them up, and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. And if your vehicle came equipped with these hubcaps, make sure you line up this hole with the valve stem. Slide them on, line up all the lug nuts with these caps, and then just tighten this on. This is what holds on the hubcap, so you want to make sure that it's tight, otherwise it'll go flying off the road.